welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Tina Jha. With just a week to go before its end, the Trump administration has declassified a sensitive document on the US strategic framework for the Indo Pacific from the year 2018. The 10-page document, declassified in part by US National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, outlines the objectives and strategies with regard to China, North Korea, India, and other countries in the Indo Pacific region. Framed more than 2 years before the India-China military standoff along the line of actual control, the strategy makes more than 20 mentions of India, seeing the country as pre-eminent in South Asia, taking on the leading role in maintaining Indian Ocean security. And in this regard, the document says the United States will build a stronger foundation for defense cooperation, expand defense trade and ability to transfer defense technology to enhance India's status as a major defense partner, increase cooperation on shared regional security concerns, and also encourage India's engagement beyond the Indian Ocean region. On the other hand, China is seen as the primary state actor of concern outlined in this particular document. As per the framework, Beijing is increasingly pressuring Indo-Pacific nations to subordinate their freedom and sovereignty to a common destiny envisioned by the Chinese Communist Party. So on this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the declassified US report on Indo-Pacific and the growing importance of India in the region. Joining me on the program are Mr. Shakti Sinha, Director, Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of International Studies, Vadodara, former Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, and Dr. Sriram Cholia, Foreign Affairs expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. So before we go on to discuss the key points that have been mentioned in the declassified report, let's first try and understand the purpose behind declassifying the document at this time. Because under the US system, such documents usually remain a secret, but just before its end, the Trump administration has declassified this 10-page strategy, of course, with slight redactions. So what does this move by the Trump administration signal?
As regards the question which you have asked, why the declassification at this particular juncture? Well, there are many experts in the United States who feel that perhaps it was to divert attention from the attack on the Capitol. But my view is that this was not so, because the decision to declassify was taken well before the attack on the US Capitol took place. My understanding is that the declassification is an obvious attempt for policy continuity. This is in light of concerns that a Biden administration may not be so committed to challenging China's bid for dominance, or indeed to the idea of an Indo Pacific, particularly in its free and open variant, because it is this idea which has served as a rallying cry for regional solidarity against coercive Chinese power. Now, there is a great deal of significance which is attached to India in this particular document. Let me mention that this document has provided the critical template for formulating US policy since 2018, when Donald Trump had signed it. And it outlines the strategy to counter Beijing's increasing influence in the Indo-Pacific, plans to deal with North Korea, as well as the importance of strengthening India as a military counterbalance to China. Now, I may underline the fact that this declassified document sees India as a net provider of security, with the object of being, of this framework being to solidify an enduring strategic partnership with India, which is underpinned by a strong military able to effectively collaborate with the US. So in my view, the release of this document, which would otherwise have been made public only in the last year of, I think, 2042 or something,
Yes.
way later than it has been actually made public, is because the Trump administration, and not just Donald Trump, wants continuity in this policy, which has been very, very carefully prepared by them for keeping China underpinned and for being able to counter its expansionism. That is my introductory remark and reading of this situation.
Okay, let me take that point to Mr. Cholia. Do you agree that this move signals continuity of the United States Indo Pacific strategy to key partners, especially India, Australia, and Japan, amid the change in administration that's going to happen in the country?
Yeah, Tina, it's a transition period. So I think the outgoing administration wants the same level of pressure that they had applied on China, or even more than that, to carry on in the new incoming Joe Biden administration. And there are, like Ambassador was saying, some signals that Biden administration may not be as aggressive in pushing back against China as Trump was, at least in the last final 2 years of his term. So I think the timing is explained by that. And in a way, if you see, the Trump administration had something called a national security strategy that they issued early in the administration in 2017. And then this seems to be a subset of that for this region, because, you know, their national security strategy encompasses different regions of the world. And I think increasingly now there is a bipartisan consensus, whether one agrees or not that Biden will be softer on China. I mean, that's a debate in itself. But otherwise, it does seem to, there seem to be the establishment view in the US is that China poses a, overwhelming threat to American values and interests. And therefore, it must be pushed back using all means. And there are good signs that this will indeed happen, because you look at the Biden team, the new team that's coming in, Antony Blinken, for example, the State Secretary of State, he's on record telling Indian Americans just before the US election that we have a common challenge to deal with, and what he calls increasingly assertive China. And he says, including its aggression towards India at the line of actual control. And he says we have to put ourselves in a position of strength to tackle China. And he says India is going to be a key partner in that effort. So that's quite clear. Biden himself has said this. Blinken has articulated it more. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, the new national security advisor of the Biden administration, is saying the US should devote more military assets and resources for freedom of navigation missions in South China Sea, which is the music to the ears even for a Trump team, In that sense, although there's a lot of domestic polarization and ideological rivalry and hatred between the Democrats and Republicans, on this factor, there seems to be generally a broad consensus. Kurt Campbell has just been named by the Biden administration as their new Indo Pacific coordinator. This is a new position they're creating within the National Security Council. He's a hawkish Democrat on foreign policy. He was architect of the pivot to Asia policy under Barack Obama administration. So the idea that the US should focus more and more on Indo-Pacific, I think, is now becoming mainstream. Some people, nitpicking, they look at why has Biden not used the word Indo-Pacific? Is he, does he even believe in this term? There's a lot of, speculation going on. But I think all of that will be put to rest, because typically, whenever there's a new US administration, they start off a little slow off the blocks. They think that maybe they can work out a little bit and moderate or lower the temperature with China. But eventually, what happens is, because the Chinese push for hegemony is so relentless and so ruthless that whether you're a dove or a hawk, it doesn't matter in Washington. Ultimately, you realize that this is a menace, and that has to be tackled. So I think we would like them to, hit the ground running. And I'm sure that all the Quad partners and all the main players in Indo-Pacific have already reached out to the Biden transition team to ensure that what Trump had envisaged in 2018 will not only carry forward, but will be, fast forwarded. We need more alliances. We need more solidification of the coalitions in the region, which were weak under Trump, because Trump's was more like, unilateral pressure on China. He was not so good at forming alliances or broad-based coalitions, but we are expecting more from Biden. Of course, there are a lot of domestic problems, and it's not easy for the US to immediately come in the new administration and start applying pressure on China,
Okay.
as case. But nonetheless, I think it's a step in the right direction. So releasing it is to ensure that the US knows and does not forget who the real challenge is. It is not Russia. It is not Iran. It is not even North Korea,
North
although
Korea.
North Korea is subset of the Chinese problem. It is China. So let's put it up front.
And that's why the report makes at least 20 mentions of India. Mr. Sinha, the report highlights how India figures as a key player in the US strategy as far as Indo Pacific region is concerned. But also it largely talks of bolstering India's rise only to counter China. On that aspect, if we try to understand, how does the US policy differ from India's Indo Pacific approach?
That's a very interesting point. But frankly, when I read the document yesterday evening, when it came out, I did not at all feel surprised. This has been quite obvious for some time now that the USA does see itself in need of partnerships in that sense. And the fact that in this part of the region, not just Indo-Pacific, but even, the broader Indo-Pacific, not just the Indian Ocean, where we see ourselves from Aden to Malacca, that India has to do more. India can only do more diplomatically, militarily, and intelligence if it works with other partners. And this point, I think, is a very good document, which makes it very clear that the USA has to work to strengthen Indian capabilities on all these three international fronts: diplomatic, military, and intelligence. So whether it's counterintelligence, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's dealing with the new forms, biogenetics, and all the forms cutting-edge technologies, India has capacities, has to be strengthened in the larger interest of maintaining a rule-based order. Because the report keeps talking again and again of the Chinese need for hegemony, of an illiberal world order, of undermining other countries, unfair trade practices, industrial espionage, all kinds of things. It specifically mentions in Vis-A-Vis India border and diversion of river waters. Brahmaputra, it doesn't say the word Brahmaputra, but it does talks about access to water resources for India. Obviously, the making of dams in. So, in all these aspects, it sees India as a very important player to counterbalance China. Why does it counterbalance China? Precisely for the reasons that I cited, because China is a threat to the liberal rules-based order. And India, therefore, has a very important role to play. Once again, to conclude, there's nothing in it that I find surprising. Yes, for us, many times we feel, oh, why should we play the Americans' tune? No, it's not about playing the Americans' tune. It's about what Mr. Vajpayee understood in 1998. We are natural allies. Why are we natural allies? Because we have a convergence of interest and a convergence of values. And therefore, when you are counterbalancing, you're not doing it at America's bidding. You're doing it to protect yourself. But you can't do it yourself. You have to work in partnership of equal countries, sovereign countries.
Okay, let me take that question to the ambassador as well. Do you see any difference in the US strategy vis-a-vis India's approach when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, the US is concerned about China's expansionism, both in the territorial sense and in the economic one. And we have also reasons to be concerned about the same fact. So I would think that there is more convergence rather than divergence in this regard. I may take on the point that Mr. Sinha was making about the fact that we could be natural allies. In fact, India and the United States should be natural allies. We are both democracies, we are secular, we are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic, if you also please. But when India became independent in 1947, the Cold War was already on, and India chose to be independent, a non-aligned country. Now that was misunderstood by the Americans, who viewed matters in a different perspective. In their view, either you were with them or you were against them. So unfortunately, what happened was that a military dictatorship like Pakistan, headed by generals like Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan, and Ziaul Haq, became allies of Pakistan, while India was forced to go into a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. Now, things naturally changed at the end of the Cold War because the Soviet Union collapsed. And the new threat which has emerged is from China. The United States took time to realize it. I think we were cognizant of the threat emanating from China way before the Americans were, because they are the ones who helped to strengthen Chinese economy and make China such an important global player. We were conscious of the threat from China because China was in occupation of thousands of miles of our territory. Thankfully now, America's understanding of China has become more realistic, and it sees in India a country which is standing up to China and with which the United States should develop closer linkages. And I think this policy document, which has been declassified, speaks of this in very clear terms. As Mr. Shakti Sinha said, there's nothing surprising in it. We have seen it in evidence as things have unfolded. We have seen how the United States has actively engaged in the 2+2 dialogue with us. We have seen how it has tried to augment everything that exists in the nature of the Quad, including by making it a military alliance also, where countries which are members of the Quad have military. So I'm not surprised about the content of the strategic document either. I think that it's going to be a guiding principle of American policy, particularly in the strategically important area of the Indo Pacific in the years to come.
Okay. Mr. Cholia, so while we talk about China emerging as a great threat in the Indo Pacific region and the US seeing India as a counterbalance to China, let me also understand from you, why is the Indo Pacific region becoming the new arena for strategic rivalry? And if so, what should India's approach be towards getting more and more like-minded countries in its fold and then countering China more aggressively?
Yeah, the reason why Indo-Pacific is now like the fulcrum for geopolitical contestation is because of the phenomenal rise of China. And until 20 years ago, it was not seen as so important. In fact, even until the Obama administration and even for a while under Trump, there was a division of attention. I mean, the US was often distracted by Russia, by the Middle East. George W. Bush went into wars in the Middle East, and in many ways, it allowed China to quietly, build muscle and to strengthen itself without any kind of pressure or any kind of check on its rise. Now, as of 2020, US Indo-Pacific Command, for example, has something like 60% of all the US Navy ships are in this region. 55% of the army, US military army is positioned here. 2/3 of the Marines are in the Indo-Pacific. So you can see that concentration. And likewise, the Chinese counter buildup is also tremendous. I mean, the kind of anti-ship missiles they have developed, the kind of aerial thrust they are making on Taiwan, across the South China Sea, their Coast Guard, their Navy. So it's so in that sense, and also the Chinese have also tried to wade into our backyard in a big way in the last decade or so. In the name of Belt and Road Initiative, they have encroached. They have got close relationships with many of India's traditional neighbors, and we see that in Sri Lanka. We've seen that in the past in Maldives, in Bangladesh, in Nepal. So in that sense, the Chinese do not believe that their overcapacity in terms of industrial production and the surpluses they have accumulated, they do not believe that they can be used domestically. They need access to more and more territory. And the debt trap, the way they are grabbing a strategic land all over. So I think that is what is creating this perfect storm in the Indo-Pacific. And like many of the American thinkers and policymakers are saying, there is a problem with balance of power. And historically, whenever the balance of power in Asia is getting skewed, the US tries to hold it back and tries to retain the status quo. So the US is still a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, But increasingly, they believe that if it comes to war, short of war, they are not able to dislodge the Chinese. The Chinese are breaking through what is called the first island chain, second island chain, all the old notions of containing China. The Chinese are just bursting at the seams and breaking free. So this is the time, I think that's why, and India, Japan, Australia, some of the ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, people often don't mention South Korea. The problem during Trump was they had the vision, but they're very haphazard. And because Trump had other agendas, populist agendas, he could not bring everybody together under one platform. For example, Japan and South Korea almost broke away. Their intelligence sharing, joint defense, everything had gone awry over a historical dispute. The US could not bring them together. They were struggling. But I think under Biden, there's going to be more of an emphasis on, it's not going to be USA versus China. The USA realizes it is far away. Geographically, it cannot project power in China's backyard forever and in a massive way. So they need everybody else along. And that is where India matters. That's where these other countries matter. And all of us should realize this, and we should extract better terms from the US going forward, knowing that they are desperate to stop China. And we should also make sure that the US does not, as I said, get diverted by other crises and other regions of the world, because that would be another costly mistake. Once we have seen this 2 to 3 times in the last 20 years, and we would not want them to again get distracted with other crises. So I think it's very important to keep the focus on China and to engage with the Americans to work together in third countries. For example, in Sri Lanka, yes. Now the Rajapakshas are back. There's a talk that the Chinese are again, muscling in. Let us jointly with the United States and India together do something to alleviate this pressure. Same in Nepal. To give 2 examples, in our own neighborhood, where there is a threat of a renewed, Chinese intervention and overtaking of the local processes. So I think US, India +1, we should do together stuff in third countries or fourth countries, or jointly with the Japanese for infrastructure, for building connectivity corridors. It's not only military. Americans often say this, Indo Pacific is not only a military construct. We have to do civilian things together. So I think there are a lot of areas where there is convergence, but a lot of work needs to be done with a singular vision that, we don't want a Sino-centric Indo Pacific or a Sino-centric Asia at all.
Mr. Sinha, so, the significant role that India is expected to play in the Indo-Pacific region with cooperation from the United States, with countries like Australia, Japan, is it going to impact relations with our traditional allies, especially Russia, if we talk about? Because when it comes to India Quad cooperation, Russia doesn't seem to be on a very, very happy foot.
Absolutely. In fact, Russia has been very vehemently attacking the concept of Indo-Pacific. Last year, when the Russian foreign minister was in Delhi, Sergei Lavrov, he was almost ridiculing the concept of the Indo-Pacific and arguing for the Asia-Pacific. But it's time we worked with the Russians, and I'm sure we are doing that, to explain that when we had the concept of the Asia-Pacific, starting with the APEC in the early 1990s, Asia-Pacific stopped at Thailand. Countries west of Thailand were not part of it, and therefore India was out of it. India is facing the brunt of the Chinese rise, right? Whether it's borders, whether it's on trade, whether it's in our neighborhood, as Sriram very rightly said, it's undermining democracies, it's undermining regimes in our neighborhood very blatantly, very openly. It's putting some of them in a debt trap, in which case they are bound to China. We are facing it. For us, definitely that Asia-Pacific is a dead concept. Indo-Pacific makes it clear that we are very much part of not the problem, the solution. And therefore the rise of India in the Indo-Pacific is something that has to be understood in a context of maintaining stability in the region, reducing tensions. Now, Russia's unfortunate problem is that Russia economically and demographically is losing out. Russian military remains very good. Russian technology in some of the sectors remains very good. But the non-oil, non-mineral economy is shrinking at a fast rate. Their population is shrinking at a fast rate. So Russia sees this window of opportunity in the world reducing. Russia has tied up with China very emphatically, to loans, to pipelines, selling of oil, selling of gas, and other ways. Military exercises now in the Pacific with China and Iran in this part of the world. So Russia's position is slightly changing. We have to understand that. We still want to have good relations with Russia. The fact that we're going ahead with the SS-400 means that we are very interested in having a work relation with Russia, very good relation with Russia. But this kind of divergence is happening. We have to understand it. Chinese are now buying over Russian high-tech companies. Biden, unfortunately, and there I'll be slightly more this thing, Biden, unfortunately, has gone on record saying the biggest challenge America faces is from Russia. But the fact is today, Russia is clearly its subordinate in a Russia-China partnership. And therefore, we have to need work with the Americans and the Russians to see that both understand what the situation is. To the Americans, to say, yes, Russia is important for you, but China is the bigger threat. So it's going to be a difficult job, but I'm confident that India, which is very vast diplomatic strength and leverage across the world, will put this point across to Russia fairly comfortably.
Absolutely. Ambassador, one interesting point that the document states is when we talk about Chinese threat, that China seeks to dominate cutting-edge technologies, which includes artificial intelligence, also biogenetics, and then use them in the service of authoritarianism. So now when we talk about the threat from China in all these aspects, how will the world going forward stand up to this threat, particularly if we talk about India?
Well, India realizes that the threat from China is not going to disappear. We are going to face this threat for a long, long time. Other countries are only now beginning to wake up. For long, China was looked at with a relatively benign eye. But the danger from China in all areas has become crystal clear to everybody. You mentioned a few of the areas. But Chinese threats, not just territorially, economically, but also in the area of cyber technology, have become a nuisance for all countries. And it is significant that Joe Biden has reacted in a very correct manner to the declassification of this important security report, because he has created a new position within the National Security Council, and he has appointed a very senior analyst, Campbell, who will be focusing on the challenges which are emerging from China in the Indo Pacific. Now, it just shows that the objective of in trying to ensure continuity in regard to the policy towards China, I think is going to be maintained. And I think in our dialogue with the Biden administration, we will be pointing out how this threat from China has to be viewed very, very seriously. And I have reasons to think that the Biden administration is becoming more and more cognizant and more realistic towards this threat.
So with that remark from the ambassador, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Time is running out. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture and putting things into perspective for us and our viewers as well. Just in case you missed the television broadcast of our program, let me remind you, you can also watch it on YouTube and you can send in your feedback and suggestions as well. Thank you very much for your time.